Most people destroy their lives because of passion. They act out of anger, jealousy, or petty revenge. They allow their emotions to cloud their mathematics, and that is exactly why they fail. My name is Victoria. I am 34 years old and I do not have that problem. I do not operate on emotion. I operate purely on logic, leverage, and probability. Pause. And logistically speaking, my marriage to my ex husband Lucas was no longer providing a sufficient return on my investment, so I dismantled him. Legally, quietly, and completely. Lucas was a commercial real estate developer. When I met him, his net worth was hovering around $40 million. He was a deeply emotional, romantic man who desperately wanted to believe in the concept of soulmates. I identified this psychological vulnerability within the first 3 dates. From that point on, I simply mirrored his expectations. I became the quiet, supportive, loyal partner he had constructed in his mind. I did not love him, but I respected the financial architecture he had built. When he proposed, his corporate attorneys insisted on an ironclad prenuptial agreement. It was a mathematically sound document that would have completely insulated his core assets from me. I did not throw a tantrum. I did not raise my voice. I simply sat across from him at his mahogany dining table, looked him directly in the eyes, and told him that a contract based on the statistical probability of our failure was highly inefficient. I told him that if we were operating as a single unit, partitioned assets would only breed distrust. Because he was governed by emotion rather than logic, he agreed. He dismissed his attorneys and we married with zero financial partitions. For 4 years, I managed his household, attended his charity galas, and optimized his personal schedule. I essentially operated as an unpaid chief operating officer for his personal life. But eventually, the environment became stagnant. Lucas lacked ambition. He was content with 40 million, while I required significantly more capital to execute my own long-term objectives. I needed to extract his assets without triggering a standard 50-50 divorce settlement. A 50-50 split would require liquidation, heavy taxation, and a prolonged legal battle. I needed a clinical transfer of wealth. So, I formulated a checkmate. Pause. Lucas's development firm was heavily exposed to corporate tax and construction liability. Everything he owned was held under one vulnerable corporate umbrella. One evening, in a very calm, detached tone, I presented him with a restructuring strategy. I suggested we create an isolated holding company to hold his liquid capital and our premium real estate. I explained that by placing this new holding company entirely in my name, we would create a legal firewall. If his development firm ever faced a catastrophic lawsuit, the creditors could not touch assets that legally belonged exclusively to his wife. I presented it not as a demand, but as a risk mitigation strategy. I provided him with case studies and tax loop projections. Lucas, blinded by his own trust and impressed by my financial literacy, authorized the restructuring. Over the next 6 months, he systematically transferred the deeds to our $15 million primary residence, two luxury commercial properties, and $22 million in liquid index funds into a holding company where I was the sole uncontested shareholder. He left his development firm highly leveraged, retaining only enough operating capital to fund current projects. 8 weeks later, the commercial real estate sector experienced a severe correction. A primary lender pulled funding on his largest high rise project. Lucas's firm was immediately thrust into a severe liquidity crisis. He was facing corporate default within 14 days. He came into my office, highly erratic and sweating. He demanded that I immediately wire $12 million from the holding company back into the firm's accounts to cover the margin call. Pause. I did not look up from my laptop. I simply told him no. He stopped speaking. He stared at me and asked me to repeat myself. I closed my laptop, folded my hands, and maintained complete eye contact. I stated very clearly that capital belongs to my holding company. Liquidating it to save an over-leveraged and failing development firm is a mathematically unsound decision. I will not authorize the transfer. He lost all emotional control. He began screaming, turning over furniture, and threatening to hire the most ruthless litigators in the country to destroy me. He yelled that he had built that money from nothing. I let him scream until his voice gave out. Then I handed him a manila envelope. Inside were the divorce filings. I'd processed them digitally 2 hours before he arrived home. The subsequent legal proceedings were entirely predictable. His attorneys attempted to argue that I had committed fraud, but my documentation was flawless. I had committed no crime. He had willingly, in the presence of legal counsel, signed away his assets to a corporate entity that I solely controlled, citing tax optimization in his own emails. The judge reviewed the structure and ruled in my favor. The holding company was declared my separate, protected property. Because his development firm was now practically insolvent and drowning in toxic debt, there were zero marital assets left for him to claim in the divorce. Lucas went into personal bankruptcy. I retain 100% of the extracted wealth. I am told he is currently living in a small rented apartment, working as a mid level project manager for a firm he used to consider a minor competitor. People online call me a sociopath. They say that karma will eventually balance the equation, but karma is just a statistical anomaly that desperate people use to comfort themselves. I did not steal anything. I simply understood the legal parameters of asset management better than the man who owned the assets. If you are foolish enough to hand someone the keys to your empire, you do not have the right to complain when they lock you out. I suppose you can debate the morality of my actions in the comments, but morality has never paid a dividend. Subscribe to the channel if you want to understand how the real world operates.